Good morning. Let's see here. So what we're going over um, for our class here pertains to the first three administrations of the U.S. history, right, in the Republic. So from about 1788 to 1808, the first three presidents were George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, right? And so let me get your names down. And so what I chose to do on this week's argumentative assignment was to engage in great man history. That's kind of considered to many people almost obsolete as far as a school of history. Because remember, what you're contending is not necessarily that the people that you're studying are great people morally, right? Um, but you're making the assumption that that which causes history to go in the particular directions that it has taken, oftentimes largely depends upon and is influenced by the decisions made by key people in power, by powerful people, right? So that's what we're talking about with great man history. Is we're looking at basically biographical information on the first three presidents, right? Because it's much more common now for historians to do social histories, histories on culture, on typical behavior, on the typical lifestyle of the working class people in a given era in American history, et cetera, et cetera. For obvious reasons that you could guess, people, first of all, don't believe necessarily in that type of determinism, that it's just that simplistic, that things happen simply because of the personalities and decisions of people in power. And then also it's politically incorrect. It's very elitist and a bit archaic from an old school way of looking at history. And so it doesn't happen as often now in academia. So it's the only time I do it amongst all my assignments. So I thought, what the heck? I could at least do one in the old school fashion. All right. And so any comments on anything pertaining to this assignment? I know I took a day. I've been bad at that, of not putting on your assignment until like Monday night. But any comments on the assignment itself? Questions? Anything that was unclear? Anything that you found interesting or thought provoking? If you've had the chance to peruse it yet. All right. So with this handout, I mean, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Okay. So oftentimes I'm going to share screen. Oh, I'm sorry. Someone had a question and I just hit it. I'm sorry. Could you let me see if I can retrieve that? Okay, that's okay, Omar. Thank you for your honesty. Like I said, I didn't put it up until last night anyway. No problem, Joanna. Thank you though for your honesty. And so let's kind of just introduce you to this stuff, okay? So with number one, right? When people are selecting facts and interpreting them and presenting them, right, as historians do, and they look at George Washington and his administration, is oftentimes they can't help but get caught up into discourse, talking about partisanship, right? About the country being split in half between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. So our two-party system, as you probably noticed or already knew prior to the class, you will not find ideological origins for it in the Constitution, right? You have kind of a recognition of it about, like, factions by the writers of the Federalist Papers, but like I said, nothing explicit that would state that the founding fathers planned for and established a two-party system, right? We had come technically from a multi-partied system of England, although they technically had two parties, the Tories and the Whigs, in the parliamentary runnings and the power plays of England. So at any rate, looking at this, right, um, you find that George Washington, right, you find kind of a dichotomy, if you will. So let's go ahead, go back to sharing the screen. Let's see here, my early republic, and I'll be happy to put any and all of these up, okay? But, kind of a left and right, if you will, and this is kind of simplistic. Um, but kind of the left and the right here with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. What's ironic from the get-go, right, is Alexander Hamilton came from very humble origins. What was it, a Danish peddler and merchant in the Caribbean, and his mother, he was born of quote illegitimate birth. The father left, impoverished, had to work from the time he was 9 years old. Kind of a Horatio Algier story of him impressing superiors that he worked for and continually getting more and more opportunities because of his good reputation as a young, bright, ambitious man and worker. And so they ended up, some of these gentlemen, businessmen, subsidized him to have a college education, and just a real rags to riches story, this Alexander Hamilton, right? And what you find a little bit perhaps ironic, I don't know, maybe it's not, but he will be a conservative, right? He will be on our proverbial right of our political spectrum. I remember when the French Revolution, those who wanted to stay and maintain a lot of tradition, right? The way things had been done before, the way institutions functioned and existed before, were proverbially on the right side of the assembly and the estates general, and those who wanted radical change from the past, from tradition and history, they were on the left, right? And so with Hamilton, you find some conservative, facets to his platform. So, for instance, right, um, Adam Smith and his Wealth and Poverty of Nations, and his idea that all transactions ought to be privatized, right, and allow the laws of nature, of human nature and psychology, of economics, etc., right, kind of early before saying it, of sociology, etc. Let those laws of nature carry themselves out, right, naturally, without government intervention. And that was an enlightened work that was written, right? And it was in line with deism at that time, right? That natural laws, that which is natural and adheres to natural laws, is healthiest and best. And so, at any rate, he didn't stray that far in this new novel, idea. He definitely was not a friend of mercantilism. I mean, my goodness, right? Under strict mercantilism, he wouldn't have had the opportunities he had, right? Because he was not connected to the nobility in any way, et cetera, et cetera. Nevertheless, he was very much, practical, pragmatic, you might say, and that he thought that the baby shouldn't be thrown out with the bathwater when it comes to England and the Bank of England in particular, right? And the way that English finances were carried out, financial dealings. And so he wanted from the get-go, for practical reasons, government intervention in the economy. Okay, but again, against any of the foundational assumptions of mercantilism. Certainly not to maintain the status quo, to provide opportunities for some and not for others. He was enlightened in that way, right? He was more egalitarian as far as him being open for everyone like himself to be able to attain the American dream here in this country. But nevertheless, he was not a laissez-faire, government let it be, guy. He also, right, he and John Adams both have some kind of, what look today with our egalitarian assumptions and rhetoric today, it sounds very snobbish and elitist. They would write things, basically saying that the great general masses of people cannot be trusted with power and making major decisions. For one, right, and it goes back to, Aristotle and Plato. For one, they believed that by nature, that a lot of people were just not naturally gifted in the right areas, right? I think of Plato, right? And then that he said society ought to be ruled by philosopher kings, right? Not the common average person. That the average person is led by his or her appetite, is short-sighted, is rash, and can be irrationally misled by a demagogue. That the average person doesn't have the proper education and training, right, to be able to carry out the work that a politician needs to carry out. So hence they said men of exceptional qualities, right? Of course, like a great kind of going back to Plato again, not only natural intelligence and the things in the arts of what the science, what you might call political science today, but also a gregarious social nature by which you could read people well, you could interact with people well, you could cooperate to get things done, compromise, right, et cetera, that you also have the emotional disposition and the character and personality to be able to carry things out well collectively in a government. And so they, I liken it today, right, with you saying, okay, do you believe all people are endowed with the same inherent worth, right? That every human being born should be entitled to the same dignity, to the same rights, opportunities, privileges, right, protections, etc. And of course, by today's rhetoric and being brought up in the U.S. and quote Western civilization in the 21st century, your answer should of course be yes, right? However, do you believe that everyone is equally capable of fixing your car, of writing an English paper for you? And of course, rhetorically, right, the answer's in the question. The answer is no to the second question, and that's the way that in my loose paraphrase, I'm hoping I'm not getting that wrong, but that's how I interpret some of their writings. Is that they thought that the quote better sort, those who are more qualified by nature and more qualified by nurture. The nurture part as well, not only education, but a key term they often used was leisure, right? You don't really think about that, but just that practical, dimension to their argument is that the average person doesn't have. We talked about this with Bernard Bailyn's thesis, right, about the influence of the Enlightenment and all this written propaganda and rhetoric during the War for Independence on the common person. That the common person oftentimes did not have the time, nor the education, nor the means, but especially the time, right, to read a lengthy book written by Voltaire or Montesquieu. But instead, right, they resorted to pamphlets, which oftentimes didn't surpass 30 pages, that they did have time and an opportunity to read. And so they said men of leisure ought to be those governing, etc., who have the time to read and pontificate on things and interact with people and having healthy debate and dialogue, etc. Okay. And also, they clearly, in light of Montesquieu's writings, were all for, and they kind of became, vocal about it at times, having parts of our republic, because that's what a republic is, right? Like Rome, is you had your elected tribunes, but then you had your appointed Senate, right? Your tribunes were indirectly, I'm not your tribunes, I'm sorry, the two consuls, right? The two presidents were indirectly elected and appointed, right? And then you had your court system in Rome. And so a republic is not meant to be all democratic, right? All ruled by majority rule, 50% plus one. And so they wanted at times the president to serve a life term. They were all for the Supreme Court justices serving a life term. And so you could make the argument that they wanted this republic less democratic than it is today, right? For the simple reason I'm just thinking automatically because senators, right? After the 19 teens, senators are now directly elected by the people. So technically, our republic, for that reason alone, is arguably more democratic than it was under the founding fathers. And so, you have that for sure. And then with Jefferson, right? Ironically, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. His mother, right, was a Randolph, a very well connected family. He was entitled to sit on the governor's hand-picked, unelected, nobility oriented council of Virginia, and he refused to accept it. He wanted to run for office instead in the assembly, like anybody else. But he had that opportunity. It was there nevertheless. He had the finest of education, tutors, got to go to Europe, several times, had, slaves to tend to him, part of the Virginia gentry class, right? A man of leisure. He did not have to work, engage in manual labor. He did not have to any time of his life. You could arguably contend, right? With his father, Peter Jefferson, inheriting his mother's family stuff and slaves and plantation, etc., down in Virginia. So, at any rate, despite being a well-to-do man, right, he becomes the public voice of the people. People like himself and later on James Madison, somewhat James Monroe, Patrick Henry. Okay, so they wanted the republic to err, if anything, on the side of being more democratic than anything else, right? Uh, they um, they talked about the sagacity, right? Like the worldly wisdom, the practical common sense of the average man. When I think of, perhaps it's not a very apt uh, um, analogy, but I think of, like in professional sports and baseball, etc., when the regular fans can select the all stars, right? The assumption is you don't have to know baseball that well. You certainly don't have to be physically gifted to play it well, to be able to see and acknowledge, detect, right, and value um, those capabilities in another human being, in a professional player, right, and trusting the common fan to make that discernment. And likewise, right, with these Democrats of that time period, is they contended that the common person can elect, right, people that are well prepared for that position, right? That they know talent, they know education, they know experience and intelligence and capacity when they see it, and they'll be shrewd in their decisions in electing their representatives, right? Because of course we're not talking about direct democracy under Pericles of Athens, right? Nobody's that democratic amongst the founding fathers. No one is in egalitarian fashion pushing for universal citizenship for all demographics, right? Women, African Americans, Native Americans, etc. No one's that far to the left, unfortunately, of that generation, you could argue, amongst the well-known founding fathers. And so Jefferson, right, is riddled with contradictions, you could argue. But at any rate, he he said much about the common people and and trusting majoritarian rule more than any other form of government, like with Aristotle under a republic, right? An oligarchy, the wealthy few and educated, or a monarchy, right? A powerful executive. Of those three categories of Aristotle's, he definitely favored having the democratic element to be the most prominent, right? So at any rate, he even talked about at times, right, trying to allocate free land to the poor white population out in the frontier area of Virginia when he was a legislator and governor of Virginia, um, and wanted education for the common people to be attainable. So public schools, he was a big advocate for that at the level of Virginia and later on at the level of the national level, right? To have implement a public school system. And I'm going to get back to that in just a moment. And he was big on the rhetoric, right, of a lot of the libertarian thoughts of that day, right? Is that government, none of us can be trusted. He told John Adams, right? You and I would become wolves if they let us. He said, you know darn well that's the truth. Even you and I would become wolves if the people gave us too much power, that no one could be entrusted with unlimited arbitrary power. So hence, right, to him, with human nature, You need to have it err on the side of being democratic, right? The collective majority, let them make most the important decisions, but also keep things decentralized and small. Don't allow the government to accrue too many resources, a big standing army, lots of tax revenue from the people, right? That you're just creating a beast that you're going to end up someday falling prey to as a victim to that beast's tyranny, right? And so at any rate, he wanted, he even advocated the idea, and I think arguably maybe under Plato and other writings that he had read, the idea of hundreds, of having a political district of only 100 citizens, and have them in many ways be almost autonomous. So he was very much for having a very decentralized democratic republic, right? However, what you could also argue is the political spectrum, the gap therein, arguably, especially compared to like Latin America, you could make the argument was not that broad, was not, the gap was not that big between our left and our right. So, for instance, right, Hamilton and John Adams, they still wanted a constitutional, right, so that the Constitution lays out explicit powers, checks and balances, right, assurances of individual rights. They wanted a constitutional framework, and from the beginning, they were for popular sovereignty, right? That government exists by the permission, its authority exists by the permission or consent of the governed. They were for having a mixed government, a republic, in light of Montesquieu's spirit of the laws. So they were very enlightened. They were not that far to the right, right? Um, yes, they were for, they were snobbish about what the general population was capable of discerning on their own, right? Um, but they, and despite that kind of snobbishness about the ignorance, the lack of self-control, the tendency to be led by their emotions of the common people, they still wanted a popularly elected house, right? With its checks and powers over the Senate and over the president, etc. Right? And then when you look to the left, right? Uh, really, how far to the left was Thomas Jefferson? Well, he kept slaves up to his death. He was xenophobically frightened of miscegenation. Miscegenation is interethnic sex, marriage, procreation, right? Having biracial children. I mean, you just read some very, very um, xenophobically ugly quotes from him, especially later in his life, about the fear of the Black population living amongst and intermingling with and cohabitating with and having children with the white population. He did not think that Black people were inferior circumstantially, like some Benjamin Franklin did, right? But he felt they were innately by nature um, inferior. And so, hence, when you have that type of racist sentiment, there's almost there's no solution, right? Because no matter what you change in their environment, no matter what education you offer them, religion, religious assimilation, etc., they're still going to have those biological, um, stigmas that you put on them. And so, in light of today, it looks awful. And how ironic, right? In light of his children, his 4 children that came of age with his slave, right? His biracial children. So at any rate, you find a lot of contradictions with Thomas Jefferson. Uh, and so also, when pushed by John Adams and the conservatives, he admitted that he felt that putting decisions in the hands of the common people will inevitably lead to a lot of problems, that the people will inevitably, he fit into those same conservative stereotypes, that they're not educated enough, that they're not well controlled, they're not rational enough, right, and too emotionally laden, that they're going to oftentimes make poor decisions. But to him, right, democracy, having the republic be lean toward being more democratic, was merely a lesser evil. That he thought that the poor decisions made by the common people out of ignorance or in being led by emotion, right, or pathos, that the results of that would not be as dangerous as the manipulative decisions would be by a an educated elite that knew exactly what they were doing and were doing it with all of the wrong um, intentions, right? So pardon me, you guys, but I've noticed I have 3 or 4 more participants. I want to make sure that you get your credit here. See here. Sorry for the interruption here, but like I said, I want to make sure that everyone gets his or her credit. So is everyone with me so far? Anyone have any comments or questions? Anybody at all? You guys are awfully quiet, which I guess is okay as long as you're not asleep and you're absorbing this stuff. Okay, I think I have it all. Shoot. Bear with me here. Sorry. Okay, now I have it. Thank you. So, um, so right back to this point that arguably the left and right weren't that far apart on the spectrum. Um, you make the argument that Thomas Jefferson was not that democratic by today's standards. He didn't advocate universal citizenship. He sure as heck didn't advocate direct democracy, which was impractical anyway, right, with the size and population of the country. Um, he also, like I said, argued that the democratic element to our republic was a merely a lesser evil, right? Because to him, especially, that was especially the case before Americans had been properly educated in a public school system. So that was all the more reason why he advocated public education, right? Um, but also not only innately his innate theories of racist theories against African Americans, but also look up what he thought about women and their natural nature and capacity, etc. Again, it was not environmental, in which he thought that you put them in a certain environment, educate and train them in a certain way, right? That they could share in the political and economic responsibilities of the nation. No, his stereotypes against them were just that. They were essentialist. They were allegedly by nature that women couldn't help it, that they were this way. And it largely adhered to the old English ideas of separate spheres, right? That women were innately more emotional and less intelligent and practical, that they were weak constitutionally, emotionally, and physically, and less capable of being independent, that a formal education beyond a dame school, a proper elementary school level basic literacy included education was not necessary for women, and the list goes on and on. And so with people like Jefferson, you think, my goodness, were they really that far to the left? And not to mention, Jefferson was an avid imperialist. He wanted to take over other lands, Native American lands, French and Spanish lands to the west, Mexican lands, and Latin American lands. He even spoke about the island of Cuba eventually becoming ours, et cetera, et cetera. And so, like I said, not that far to the left, arguably, especially by today's standards. When you look in Latin America, look up other people, right? Um, like Francisco de Miranda, okay, and others who wanted like land redistribution out to the poor peasants, democratic government, right? Um, and not just a republican form of government, a mixed government like Rome's. Um, you know, I just a total break away from Christianity and the Catholic Church. The left was very far to the left in Latin America. Um, and then to the right of the spectrum, you have monarchists in Latin America, just in Mexico beneath us, who wanted a monarch over, Iturbide, Agustin de Iturbide, called himself Emperor Augustine Iturbide the First. They didn't want constitutional checks. They didn't want checks and balances amongst the three branches, right? They wanted a standing army with all the the old traditional um, uh, prerogatives and privileges that they'd had under England. They wanted an established church, of course, the Catholic Church in Latin America. And so, you can make the argument that the right was much further to the right. Oh, and not to mention the left in Latin America, right? Like Vicente Guerrero and Francisco de Miranda. The left wanted universal citizenship, at least for men, and to think of the miscegenation in Latin America, right? All the different shades and colors of men, including, right, the negros, right, the African Americans and the Indios, the natives. They wanted to include them in citizenship, in their government, in society. It's like, wow, that is the left, right? And that is the right when you look at Mexico and Latin America. And so that's my 2 cents, right? Because for one, I feel like it's going to put off, um, it's going to help put off drama that's going to be resolved in the Civil War. But also in the short run, I think it helped peaceful transitions of power. Because when you see the elections of like 1796 and then 1800 between John Adams and Jefferson, right? You can't take it out of context of the French Revolution that was going on at that time. And they both, right, engaged in like these scare tactics, right? Hyperbole, I would say, uh, you know, um, uh, manipulative, uh, uh, deliberate exaggeration, right, about the opposition, saying, right, that Jefferson, he's a Jacobin, right, like the French Revolution. He's going to declare war against the wealthy. He's going to confiscate their lands. He's going to have them beheaded just simply for belonging to uh, that type of estate in society. That he's going to have, these mock trials and executions against the wealthy. Um, and John Adams, the opposition said that he's going to return to a monarchy, and he's going to scrap the Constitution, and he's going to be like the powers that were fighting against Napoleonic revolutionary France, right? Like Prussia and Austria, etc. Still with kings and emperors and nobility, etc., and an established church. And so, but to me, right, when John Adams won in 1796, Jefferson stepped down, and so did his supporters. When Jefferson won in 1800, John Adams stepped down and went back home. Because to me, I believe they knew that deep down, although they didn't want to admit it during election time, right? Because they were engaged in strategic exaggeration, scare tactics, that they knew they were not that fundamentally far from one another on the spectrum. So hence, because the opposition won, it was not the end of the world for them, and they knew it. That the other side was really not that different from them. But when you get to more fundamental decisions to be made, what do we do about citizenship? What about women? What about African Americans, right? When you get into those more polarizing subjects, that's what's going to try and test, right? Our political institutions, our politicians, etc. Because you can make the argument that we kind of stayed superficial, right, in allowing slavery to persist. And even though some people at that time were progressively against it, um, not touching the race issue, not touching the sex or gender issue, not really touching the Native American issue. They didn't want to touch a lot of the fundamental issues that were addressed in Latin America. But in Latin America also, right, you have a lot of coups and civil wars and revolutions and scrapped constitutions. Because you might make the argument, for one, the left and right knew how far apart they really fundamentally were, and that hence they did have reason to believe that life as they knew it, uh, the um, uh, the goals that they had, the vision they had, right, for the country was fundamentally threatened because the other side, so radically different, had won, right? So that's my 2 cents. It's nothing intellectually impressive. It's kind of obvious, I think. But I think that's one thing that was bittersweet amongst our founding fathers, that they were really not that far apart, left from right. They shared a lot of fundamental premises. Uh, they were too afraid, for lack of a better adjective. They were not willing to address certain key, provocative, polarizing issues, right? They kind of kick that can down the road for future generations to have to contend with. Um, and so hence we had peaceful transitions of power, liberal conservative, throughout our republic's history. Okay. So looking at this, right, George Washington, the common joke was, right, that against the number one army in the world, arguably, with the Empire of Great Britain in the 1770s and early 1780s, that George Washington was fearless. But when he tried to hold together our baby republic, in the midst of liberals and conservatives having a lot of friction, right, and political debate through the press, etc., that he was scared to death, that he was even timid, right? That in its own way, this was a more daunting, in his estimation, um, responsibility than had been leading the Continental Army against England or Great Britain. So at any rate, he becomes the president, elected in 1788 until 1796, right? He does 2 4-year terms. And that oftentimes is the underlying theme to his presidency, is that he is trying to hold together the left and right, with this paternalistic facade, that I don't even so much facade, but image, public image, right? Like he is the disinterested father figure, right, over the liberals and conservatives. And to him, it is like a grieved, annoyed father seeing his 2 sons fight with each other, right? His liberal and conservative son fighting with each other. That he's grieved by it, he's annoyed by it, and he's trying to cement them in a world of coexistence, because he knows he can't stop it from happening, but that he could at least keep it civil, keep it within the confines of the Constitution and the election process, right? An amendment and legislation process, keep it within legal bounds so that we don't have a civil war, a coup, a revolution, right? Because remember, it's important, they say, to remember the insecurity they felt in light of the fact that we had already had tried and scrapped one form of government, right? We tried the Articles of Confederation, and they did not last long at all. So they had reason to fear, right, that this government, this new government, was not going to work. So at any rate, the idea is, in the popular narrative, is Washington tried to hold the two together, right? So the cabinet that he chose was from the left and from the right. However, right, as you see here, his Supreme Court justices all seem to be conservative, right? So hence, in some ways, the liberals, like Jefferson said, Washington kind of betrayed. He kind of revealed, right, on certain occasions where he truly secretly stood, and that was on the right. So at any rate, right, um, he so for instance, he does he has this public persona whereby he goes on a goodwill tour right after he's elected and shakes hands and kisses babies. He has press conferences on a weekly basis. He has famous 2 o'clock walks that he engages in, where someone in that area could come and meet him and shake hands with him. um, so he has this public persona, right, whereby he is trying to persuade the liberals, hey, I am not like King George III, right, of England. I'm not a person with kingly or monarchical pretensions. I'm an elected president of a republic. And that is to make all the difference in the world, right? And so he, there was a guy named Philip Freneau with his National Gazette. There was another newspaper known as the Aurora that would just on a regular basis tear into, make fun of, right? George Washington. They were very iconoclastic. When I think of iconoclastic, I think of like South Park, right? Where you almost deliberately try to publicly smash and challenge that which society holds to be sacred, right? And so he tolerated them, right? He didn't have them arrested. He didn't, on a couple occasions, he actually wrote a publicized rebuttal to a couple of their articles. But he allowed the process to go, right, with our First Amendment right. And he didn't crack down in any sense on the left press at that time, right? And so hence he's doing things to try to pacify the left. He puts the spokesman of the left, arguably, Thomas Jefferson, as his Secretary of State, right, as his leader of his ambassadors and foreign policy, etc. Um, and he puts other liberals as well in his administration, in his cabinet. Um, However, also to the right, right, um, he kind of continued to have somewhat of a rock star persona. He didn't stay in his public engagements for too long. um, he kind of kept that mystique about himself, right? That, wow, this is the president, right? Because the right wanted him to do that, for him to lend his prestige to this position. So for no other reasons, for practical reasons, right? People will have a sense of awe and respect and reverence for our government, our national government, and want to keep it, right? Um, for its maintenance. So at any rate, he did that for the right. He put Alexander Hamilton, right, as his Secretary of the Treasury. And he gave him, arguably, a somewhat of a long leash. He gave him a somewhat of a lot of latitude to do as he pleased as the Secretary of the Treasury. And so right away, right, um, uh, Hamilton is going to make enemies and make people very concerned as the first Secretary of the Treasury. So, for instance, right, he creates a national bank, a Bank of the United States. Where in the Constitution does it say he can do that? You won't find it. You won't find it in any of the articles, right? But he does it nevertheless. England had a Bank of England, right? So this smacks of the Ancien regime, of the way of things done before the French Revolution, right? An old school tactic. And it's certainly not laissez-faire like Adam Smith's book, right? With capitalism, because you're deliberately having a government, federal bank over the economy. And so with that, right, he does a compromise. 1/5 of the presiding board members are government bureaucrats, and 4/5 are to be private bankers, right? Um, what is it? About 1/5, a certain percentage of there might have been only 10%, but a certain percentage of the capital to be held at any given time by this bank was to be provided by the federal government. And then the rest was through private means and the private bankers' decisions on how to fund the bank, right? So it was a mix of public and private. But and then also, right, he wanted this bank, through the bank, etc. He wanted them to raise money through a myriad of ways, but one of them, right, was through bonds, right? And with a bond, you're asking the general public to lend money to the government, right, to buy a bond certificate and to be promised um, uh, interest rates, right? Interest payments in return. So, of course, they're not to lend money to the government out of the goodness of their heart for any altruistic or patriotic reasons, but to make money, right, on interest. And he knew that. And he knew that demographically, most of those who were going to buy bond certificates would be wealthy, right? Industrial urban men, usually up in the New York area, and not to mention Europeans already getting involved. So at any rate, through this bond, right, drive, instead of being seen as a practical, you know, uh, tactic, it was seen symbolically by the left that as like a plutocracy. Remember, a plutocracy is ruled by the wealthy, connected with the government, right? That they're in cahoots with each other. And so it looked plutocratic, right? Having this bond connection with the wealthy merchants and industrialists and creditors and bankers in New York area and in Europe, right? And also, the national government wanted to take over the state's debts from the time of the War for Independence and the Articles of Confederation, right? So states like Virginia, for practical reasons, like Virginia had already paid off their debts, and states like Rhode Island and North Carolina were in great debt. And so, of course, Virginia was less inclined to want to accept this because it said, "Hey, we don't want to help foot the bill for Rhode Island. Rhode Island needs to pay its own debts, right?" So, not only the practical dimension, but the philosophical and symbolic dimension was part of it too. Is that okay? Remember, think like a good Scottish libertarian, right? What the government does for good today, as far as giving it an extra footing into your house, right? Opening up your door metaphorically and allowing the government to step its foot into your front porch, right? And into your living room. What the government does, encroaching upon your autonomy, your independence as a citizen today, even if it's for good, right? For your benefit today, can be to your harm tomorrow, right? And so if you think like a good, libertarian, you don't want the government getting involved in Rhode Island's debt, right? Because tomorrow, now they're going to be running Rhode Island finances with that kind of slippery slope thinking, or perhaps logical thinking. And so, at any rate, this was also seen with fear and wariness by the left, right? The system. And then, if that's not bad enough, right? His defense of the bank, his defense of George Washington's Declaration of Neutrality, right, during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, right, because England will fight with Prussia and Austria against revolutionary France. And so, at any rate, right, um, he uses terms that are seen as dangerous by the left. So for one, right, he cites the clause in Article 1, Section 8, necessary and proper. Remember at the bottom of that list, the enumerated powers, the specifically stated powers that Congress can engage in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. That's a good thing to a lot of libertarian liberals at that time period, right? Because for the obvious reason, okay, now the government can do these things, but if it's not explicitly on this list, then it's implied, right, that the government cannot do it. So, and that was the way that it was seen as a glass half full by the liberals, Article 1, Section 8, right? That because it was specified, that was a good thing because the list was not that long. And in the future, if it's not on that list, Congress can't do it. But it kind of gives itself somewhat of arguably a blank check with that last comment, right? At the bottom of that section, it also says whatever is necessary and proper to carry out one of the aforementioned powers. So, you could use that elastically, right, to stretch the federal government's power and where it infringes upon states' issues and so forth, right, with that necessary and proper clause. And Alexander Hamilton applies that to his case in defense of the national bank. So that's scary to the left, right? And then in addition to that, he uses the term implied powers, right? Implied and inherent powers. And those are commonly held now, but again, to the libertarians, that was not specified anywhere at the Constitutional Convention, right? That they said, hey, we're going to be literal about this. If it's not explicitly in there and given as a power to one of the branches, then they can't do it. It should be that simple, they said, right? But then when you start making the argument that, well, for instance, right, the president has power to appoint his cabinet members, but does he have the power, he or she have the power to remove them? You won't find it in the Constitution. Well, right, to those who want to give benefit of the doubt to the president, to enhance the powers of the president, right, or to try to optimize his or her latitude and what he or she can do, which of course would have been the right back then, right? They would say, of course, well, it's implied. It's not directly in there, but it's implied that he should be able to remove them as well, right? And I don't know if that was the greatest example, but that was the first one that popped in my head. And so when you say that, right, going back to his Declaration of Neutrality, okay, yes, they made it clear in the Constitution that while the president becomes commander in chief of the armed forces during war, right, it's Congress that raises the army and declares war first. So, an important distinction, they said, right, in maintaining checks and balances between the two branches. But they said, right, it's inherent in the president's job and it's implied that while he can't lead the armed forces and make major military decisions, right, with the allocation of troops and the fighting of battles before war is formally declared and an army is formally, galvanized, he ought to, as head of diplomacy, right, and making treaties with foreign nations, etc. It's implied that he ought to do everything he can to keep the peace prior to war being declared. And so he's making these very conservative arguments as the Secretary of the Treasury in defense of the president and in defense of his own, one might say constitutionally dubious national bank, right? Then, in addition to that, right, what he wants to do in his notes on the state of manufacturing, et cetera, right, he gave a couple famous speeches to Congress as the Secretary of the Treasury. And he stated, right, that he made no bones about it. He, uh, uh, Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, wanted the country to become industrialized, diversified. He wanted different manufacturing sectors, different industries, right, to develop in this country. He wanted us to become economically progressive and self-sufficient, so that we would not become dependent upon other countries for their commodities, right? That we could develop virtually everything we needed and desired here in the states themselves. Okay. And that notion, right, of and not to mention is he saw already a trend in Europe, etc., and of course will be carried out to its fulfillment, arguably during the second industrial revolution of the 1870s. Um, he saw the fact that so much of industrialization was connected to urban areas, to urbanization, to cities, right? So he saw himself as a progressive man who saw the inevitable march of economics and of society, right? That we were going to urbanize, we're going to industrialize. And the industrialized part, right, is he felt like the government needed to give training wheels to the industrial sectors, that they couldn't do it on their own, right? Again, he was not laissez-faire capitalist. And so hence he wanted the government, for instance, to put big protective tariffs on manufactured goods from for instance, the Flemish clothing from Belgium, textiles and other goods coming from England, right? What they were doing, and you see this carried out in large scale again during the second industrial revolution of your History 102 class, right? With Rockefeller and Carnegie, is the big guys, right? They could streamline their production. They could cheapen the production process, right? They also can lower their prices for their commodities and undersell you. They could kind of, proverbially pull a Walmart on you, right? Or Costco and mass produce and undersell you with their price. And arguably you want a tight budget, you can only make such quality of a product, and you could only go so low on your price before you lose money and are bankrupt. And you can't contend with larger capital, with more money to play with. And so that's what the big businesses were already doing. They were underselling their smaller competitors. So he wanted to put an artificial tax on these imported goods to artificially inflate the price of them, right? So that the American made products de facto would end up being cheaper, and Americans would buy American made products instead. So the whole idea of protective tariffs went against laissez faire economics. It was kind of seen as traditional. England had done that, etc. Right? But also, right? It is it evidence that Alexander Hamilton is extremely, um, prejudicially for the northern urban, bourgeoisie, people of the city, the merchants, the bankers, right, and lenders through the bond certificate program, right, speculators who are willing to buy securities from the government and invest and buy Western lands that the government was willing to open and sell to them, right? The wealthy were the ones who could buy most of the stuff. And then now he's helping the entrepreneurs, the business owners, right? By giving them these protective import taxes on their foreign competitors' products. So again, is this guy totally for the northern bourgeois faction? And of course, that would be unfair if you are a cash crop farmer, which most numerically Americans were, right? Or subsistence farmers growing their own food or growing a crop to sell for profit. And so how is he representing you? If you're libertarian, you want no big government, no big national, flexing of the government's muscles and doing things that are not explicitly tolerated in the Constitution, like having a bank, etc. Right? And then, not to mention, Congress, as well as his unelected cabinet, began issuing taxes on the people. And how ironic that his unelected cabinet would put a single tax on anything, right? Because that was part of the Enlightenment, Rousseau and Locke and these other Enlightenment writers in our rhetoric during the Revolution is no taxation without representation, right? We have to say okay to our own taxes. And how ironic, by the way, one of the taxes was on tea, right? In light of what we had gone through with the British. A bit ironic, right? And so in that tax system, they also put taxes on um, um, whiskey, right? And that was commonly held as a sin tax or luxury tax back in England, that you don't technically need, alcohol or caffeine, etc., right? And the government needs its source of revenues. So hence, because it's an indulgence that you could choose to indulge in or not, the government represents the right morally and ethically, right? If not legally, of course, legally as well, to tax you on it. And so, in light of that old British tradition, he taxed tea and alcohol, etc. Right? And with the alcohol, what ended up happening is it went at odds with a certain demographic of farmers, right, who could not contend with the wheat farmers of larger scale. You're already in the early 1800s, which is just a decade away. You're going to get the mechanical reaper and thresher, and then the harvester combine. That those things are on their way, but they're already tools, expensive tools, etc., that only the wealthy could engage in, giving them a huge edge over their smaller competitors. The wealthy also, early on, and it's going to definitely carry itself out through the 1800s, are going to oftentimes have business or commercial contacts with the markets, right, to get their stuff from here to there. And by the way, right, Hamilton really was big on subsidizing or economically helping the development not only of as many industries as possible, but also of infrastructure, right? Of canals and roads and ultimately railroads, right? Because he wanted markets where something was produced and where it could be bought and sold. He wanted those places connected, right? For obvious economic reasons to get the ball rolling. So he definitely, right, saw himself as economically progressive, but to his opponents, he was economically conservative. He was doing old school stuff that England itself had engaged in, right? Um, Government intervention seemed to be helping out the bourgeois faction above everybody else, right? Claiming, right, that what's good for the businessmen is good for America. And of course, that'll be a conservative argument through the 1950s with Eisenhower. And so, at any rate, going back to this, right, is with Hamilton, the farmers who could not compete with their grain. And remember, refrigeration won't be till the 1880s. And so if you can't get your grain sold on time, it rots and you lose everything that you've invested. So at any rate, with the poor would-be grain farmers, a lot of them gave up on competing in grain, and they instead, with their corn or grain, distilled whiskey. Supposedly the process was cheaper, more affordable, and then you didn't have the nearly the concern of expiration of your product, right? And you had a rather elastic demand of people wanting alcohol. So that was their quest and their means, right, to the American dream now was through distillation of whiskey. And now with this tax, that was just one more thing that Big Brother was hindering them with, right, in their quest to make it. So at any rate, they protested, and especially as people began to be defiant in paying their taxes and even getting verbally and physically abusive to the customs agents, which again, you look at the tar and feathering of the customs collectors under England, right, during the Stamp Act time period, etc. So here they go again, right? And so when news of this outbreak of rebellion and defiance of this national tax, uh, reaches the government, Washington puts his foot down. And he ironically, right, raises an army bigger than his Continental Army of 13,000 men. And he himself, partly the way there, actually physically led this army. That's never happened since, right? Where a president in a domestic dispute, right, something that he holds to be, protest oriented, insurrection oriented within the states themselves, actually leads as commander in chief his own army in quelling this. And by the way, right, that's found in Article 1, Section 8, and squashing internal rebellions is given to Congress, not the president. But here's the president doing it himself. And Hamilton, as Secretary of Treasury, ended up leading that army toward these, quote, whiskey rebels, right? And so to some people on the left, or some arguably in the middle, right, this was too much. This was too far. He had clearly shown his colors as president, right, that he was a Federalist. He was on the right. And so you add also Jay's Treaty, a treaty we made with England that had embarrassing, what's the word I'm thinking of? Not circumstances, but conditions to it, right, for this country. And you could make the argument that this was the lowest toward the end of his second term. This was the lowest ebb of Washington's popularity in the country, right? And not that he couldn't have won again in 1796 had he decided to run for a third term, but like I said, relative to before, his popularity arguably was waning, because arguably of what Hamilton was doing and of him showing his, quote, colors of being more on the right, much more on the right of the political spectrum than on the left. So all of this is tied to the popular narrative, right? That the president tried to look like, they call it the Fabian from Rome, the Fabian strategy, right? Is strategically as a politician, like Fabian did with military, right? Is if you know you can't win a certain battle, you stay out of it. You stay away from it. You let the left and right fight it out, and you hold yourself like an indifferent father figure, right? And try to weigh out the storm. And so again, lastly, what was so polarizing with during Washington's administration between left and right was the French Revolution. Okay, it starts off right And you got to remember that we had had a treaty of alliance with France, who helped us in our war for independence. And technically, that had not expired, right? You also had the fact that when they wrote their Declaration of the Rights of Man, you have a lot of common rhetoric that we have in our Declaration of Independence, etc., right? In our state constitutional writings and in our propaganda during the war about natural rights. The same literal authors and philosophers were cited, etc., right? And contending that the French Revolution was following the French Enlightenment. And so, hence, right, especially on the left, like Thomas Jefferson, they said it was our patriotic duty and our human duty, right, as modern enlightened human beings, to support the French Revolution. But then, right, the common claim by the right was that things became excessive in the French Revolution. They became too much. They became too radical, too zealous, right? Too bloody. And so, for instance, right, when the Gironde lost power of the Estates General and the government was taken over by the Jacobins, right? That's when they arguably engaged in tactics that pretty much are synonymous with class warfare. At that point, you literally could be convicted, dispossessed, and even beheaded simply for the economic class in which you were born, right? For being a nobleman. Their attack upon the Catholic Church and upon Christianity was seen by conservatives everywhere as being ungodly, right? Even demonic. Um, just their process of identifying enemies of the state and not giving them due process, and again engaging in mass executions in Paris, right? Um, the famous guillotine, cutting people's head off, right, became a symbol, arguably the symbol for a while in the early 1790s of the French Revolution. And so, you just find evidence of tyranny of the majority, unnecessary attacks upon religion and the established church, class warfare, right? Demagoguery under these demagogues that were, turning public ire and anger toward people, no due process for people, right? It became a scary occasion, a scary situation for France in the early to mid to late, actually, 1790s, right? And so Washington declared neutrality. And again, the Constitution does not state that he could do that, but he did it anyway, right? And wanted us out of foreign entanglements, Hamilton's phrase that he borrowed in his final farewell address, right? So again, to the left and right, right? This exacerbated, it made worse their ideological tension, because, right, those on the right, to them, right, some people, this confirmed how radical Thomas Jefferson and others on the left, they thought and their perception were, right? Because after all, how could they continue to support this radical, bloody French Revolution? And then remember, those on the right, with the exception of England, like Prussia and Austria, were very old school and far to the right, right? Against this French Revolution and Napoleon's army. And so hence it confirmed to some people that those on the right are secret monarchists and want to turn the clock back before the Enlightenment and certainly before the French Revolution. So in this heated atmosphere, right, you find the arrival of John Adams, our second president. Okay, John Adams, arguably, okay, in his in his public image, remember, almost no less than Alexander Hamilton, he had no problems with being depicted as a conservative in the public press and in the image of the common American people. He said things about the ignorance and the prone, tendency of the average American to be to make rash decisions, to blindly follow a leader, a demagogue, right? Um, so he had already made some enemies, right? He wasn't a big advocate for the Bill of Rights, okay? Um, and so again, he'd already, kind of chosen his side, if you will, and already alienated a lot of the libertarian liberals amongst the Democratic Republicans, right? So when he comes in, right, um, he exacerbates that. He makes it worse. Look at some of this legislation here. The Alien Act gave the president power to deport foreign radicals. At that time, you had anywhere upward of like 20 to 25,000 French and other immigrants that were fleeing the French Revolution from Europe, right? And in our much smaller population, that made a bigger ding, if you will, and they were getting a lot of press coverage, etc. So were they bringing their radical French ideas over here? You also had the arrival of a guy known as Citizen Genet, Edmund Genet, Genet, and he arguably was a bit of a rabble rouser. He came here and went on a tour for like 6 weeks, and they began establishing, right before he even met with President Washington, as a representative of revolutionary France under the Gironde, and uh, he tried to get Americans to promote war against Great Britain, right, with his mother France. He wanted them to fight here. He wanted to fight against the Spanish and the English along the Mississippi and in the Caribbean. And he tried to even raise people, American volunteers, to fight as sailors with him. And of course, right, that was very arguable under international law and under the American Constitution. For a foreign leader to come here and raise American volunteer regiments to fight in a war in which our government had not declared, right, against revolutionary France. Of course, the left wanted us to join revolutionary France, right, and not even stay neutral. So at any rate, right, um, Citizen Genet made a big impression and scared and infuriated the right in trying to raise this kind of American rebellion, if you will, for revolutionary France. He was outspokenly against the president and the Federalist Party, wanting to try to kind of circumvent, go around them, and go directly to the American people to incite their nostalgia for the revolution, right? And saying that the French were their brothers in revolution and that it was their turn to give back to this revolutionary cause to their French brothers who had helped them in their hour of need against Great Britain, right? And so you had that affair, right? You had, like I mentioned, Jay's Treaty, where the British were very heavy-handed and arrogant toward us. We asked them to stop impressing our soldiers or forcefully abducting Americans and forcing them to work under the British Navy. We'll get into more of that next topic in the War of 1812. And they would not agree to stop that. They had a very internationally dubious policy of confiscating our stuff, right? Because under international law, it would be more cemented by the Crimean War of the 1800s, but there were already these councils, these yearly councils, whereby international law was pretty much recognized already. And amongst those laws, right, if you are a neutral country and not involved in a war, that you have the right to sell whatever you want that's not on the contraband list, which of course would include, right, military supplies, that other than military supplies or contraband, you could sell whatever regular civilian products you want to one or either side fighting. That's your international right. And the English clearly were violating that and having a double standard. They were confiscating our stuff that we tried to sell to revolutionary France, our private merchants. Um, and they made no bones about it, no apologies about it, and they wouldn't agree to stop in Jay's Treaty, right? They grudgingly allowed us to open trade in the Caribbean, and they grudgingly agreed to get out of their forts that they still had not evacuated in the Ohio Valley, right on our border. Um, but like I said, they would not stop impressment. They had special taxes and conditions upon which we could enter with them, and exemptions and exclusions for us in our trade with them. and they would not stop infringing on our international rights to trade civilian products to the French. And so, at any rate, you have these as the background, right, to the this this kind of polarization, Americans going left and right and fighting with one another in the press over the French Revolution. So this is only made worse, right, with this Alien Act that gives the president the right to uh, deport French radicals, right? Because remember, Congress has power over naturalization, not the president. So they're arguably giving this power over to the president. And then the Sedition Act, right, is an infringement on our First Amendment right, stating, right, that if your act in any way encourages insurrection in any way against the government, right, or if it um, engages in libelous slander. Okay, that's the part that really arguably goes across the line regarding our First Amendment rights, right? Is that the argument is, right, is just like libel before this with other situations of colonial history, like the John Peter Zenger case, Zenger, if you want to look that up. His argument is, right, if you knowingly slander a party and you know the information you are using is false, you're guilty of libel, right? But of course, right, it was kind of implicitly accepted that that is not applied under the Constitution to the new federal government, right? I mean, you like old school days like National Enquirer and these other, somewhat dubious, um, magazines and newspapers, right? They constantly would make stuff up about the government, false accusations, etc., without fear of actually being held guilty in a court of law for libel. Well, he tried to do that here, right? And he said, hey, relax, guys. As long as you could prove what you had written is true, then you're okay, right? Under the laws of libel, and you have your First Amendment right. But if you had no reason to believe it's true, then you're in trouble, right? And you could be fined and or imprisoned. And what also made this look very dubious was the fact that he went after certain oppositional newspapers. Remember Philip Freneau of the National Gazette fame that just kind of crucified Washington and the Federalists? They went after John Adams the same, right? And he went after them to have them arrested, etc. There was a case where a guy in a tavern was making fun of the president's physical appearance, John Adams' physical appearance, and was arrested by local authorities in that tavern, right? And so, to this day, we have limitations to the First Amendment right. The the clear and present danger clause during World War I, right? You can't jokingly yell bomb on an airplane and cause a state of panic. We still have certain limitations to our First Amendment rights. But this was one that was very dubious under the Constitution and very unpopular, right? Then, in addition to that, the French, right? Because he was so frightened by the French Revolution as a conservative. In particular, John Adams was very religious, was a very vocal Christian. And so to him, the French Revolution was of the devil with its attack upon Christianity and the Catholic Church. So at any rate, he raises an army and a navy, right, during peacetime, which the left does not like, right, arguably already. Then he sends a delegation to France. And on a couple occasions, the French diplomats were very, like with the XYZ affair, etc., they were very haughty, very arrogant toward us. Like, who are you Americans, right, to dictate terms to us? We're mighty France and we're fighting mighty Britain, and you're just an upstart new American country, right? Who are you to dictate any terms to us? And so oftentimes, like the British with the Jays Treaty, the French would not agree to stop attacking our private merchants, right, and confiscating their stuff, etc. And it would have kind of a double standard toward us. So at any rate, John Adams was raising an army just in case to fight revolutionary France. And so as he does so, right, he allows some naval warships. The first famous one was the USS Constellation, right, to go into the French Caribbean. And when the French, right, tried to prey upon American merchant ships, if they were trying to trade with, the British or Dutch islands there in the Caribbean. And so the French, right, were given the permission to violate our international rights and confiscate that stuff, our Navy was to protect them. So the USS, Constellation gets involved and actually gets in a naval battle with a French warship in the Caribbean, right? And because they win and they take over the ship, it gets lots of press, and people on the right are proud. See, America is standing up for her rights against this bully nation, for her international rights and protecting her merchants in the high seas, right? But to the left, right, we haven't declared war. And they certainly didn't want us to declare war against France, right? Because they were pro French Revolution, largely on the left, at least for quite a time. So here we are in an undeclared war. The president doesn't have that right, right? To be sending boys to fight to their death, and Congress hasn't even declared war on revolutionary France. And so this was known as the quasi, the almost war, right? QUASI, the quasi war. And so to the left, they were infuriated over this, right? He was called, John Adams, a warmonger, right? And so now for the thesis is David McCullough in his biography on John Adams, right? He takes an interesting stand, kind of court history, right? I think he's very sympathetic to John Adams. Is he stating, right? And by the way, we've done number one on the handout with the Adams and Washington kind of precipitating or help causing the two-party system by being too far to the right and astonishing and angering and provoking the left into forming a rival political party. And now we're on another one with John Adams, right? Number two, that this guy was too independent minded, right, for his own good. That in politics, you need to adhere to a platform and adhere to who your political allies are and what their platform is, and almost just turn a blind eye at times when what they want runs counter to what you believe and want, right? But you got to play the game, as they say in politics, right? John Adams was too independent minded. And nay, I would say, even according to this book, had too much personal integrity to play that political game. So hence, right, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting his book, but to me, what I derived from it is that this man, right, was too honest, had too much integrity, was too independent minded for the game of politics. And in having his own mind and having his own principles, he happened to alienate himself from both the left and the right. And so, hence, it was ironically this virtue of his that did himself in politically, right? So that he became, as our second president, the first one-term president to not be reelected, because you can't make enemies on both sides and expect to win. All right, so I hope that was clear. So some of the data I just covered, right, is typically covered in this book about him alienating the left, right, as being a man on the right. Now, what about the right? Well, the idea is, right, is that, first of all, he did not invoke the Alien Act. The Sedition Act, right? The cases that I read in this book, literally 36 people in the entire country, 36, right? At least in the first several months, were actually arrested and fined, etc., according to the Sedition Act. So while they were very dubious in character, right, in their constitutionality, he didn't really enforce them. And the author more than suggests that he did this not just for practical reasons, because he saw how unpopular these laws were, but on principle itself, that he on principle knew that he was flirting with a dangerous precedent for future presidents to follow, right? And infringing upon our First Amendment rights. And he did not want to do that. Again, the idea, right, that he really, truly was not that far to the right. All right. Then also with France, on several occasions, I think, well, not several, on 2 occasions, he retracted his choice of diplomats because they were not achieving the ends that he desired. And those basically were to defend our international rights and to keep the peace with revolutionary France. Because his idea was, right, is you hope for the best, you do everything you can for the best, but you just in case prepare for the worst. So him raising an army and a navy, right, in no way to him and to the author of this book suggests that he was a warmonger wanting an excuse to go to war with Napoleonic France. That was the last thing he wanted, states this book, right? But if his worst nightmare were to materialize against his will and wishes, then we better, he thought, be ready for that worst case scenario. But you could make the argument diplomatically, he went through great steps and great effort to try to keep the peace with revolutionary France. So again, when things were not working well, he had people replaced twice. And especially the second time, right? He had him replaced with a Democratic Republican, an enemy to the left political party, right? He, as a Federalist, put in an oppositional party member simply because this party member was pro France and he knew had every desire and inclination to keep the peace with France. So, as you might guess, right, because he did this and because he would never ask Congress to declare war, like when we had that quasi war going on with France in the Caribbean, he began alienating himself from the right, who wanted to go to war with revolutionary France, right? He didn't want to go to war with them. Then there was Fry's Rebellion, where I don't have time and I don't have the recall immediately coming to me, a lot of the specifics of that case, but it reminds me of like the Haymarket Square riot in 1887, whereby you have the topics of First Amendment rights, of freedom of protest, and it devolving into physical violence, and where you draw that line, right? Well, with Fry's Rebellion, the conservatives wanted to make a point for the country and for future generations. And because violence had ensued and authoritative figures had died, they wanted John Fry's to be executed publicly for, again, to make a conservative statement, kind of like the Whiskey Rebellion, right? That law and order will be followed in this new country. Well, as a former lawyer, John Adams looks into the specifics of it and says, technically, I can't find any evidence in which John Fry's explicitly endorsed violence against the authorities. And he said on those grounds, he was pardoning him. So it was acts like this, right? Again, trying to adhere to his true convictions, because at the end of the day, according to this book, John Adams, as a devout Christian, believed that he could die at any time and he would be held answerable to God, right, for what he did and did not do as a man and as president. So at any rate, he went his own independent route, arguably. And then also, right, the Haitian Revolution, right, whereby the slaves at one given time had killed the vast majority or chased out the vast majority of white Creole Frenchmen on the island of Haiti in the Caribbean, right? And established arguably a, a republic that was largely led by and philosophically embraced, as far as its public image and identity, as a black man's republic in Haiti. It scared the heck out of the South, as you would imagine, right? And many conservatives throughout the world. Well, John Adams asked Congress to recognize this new Haitian republic. And he took a stand, he and his son, John Quincy Adams, against slavery. Well, that alienated himself from some people on the right, some Federalists as well. So again, right, it's the idea that rather than trying to please both sides, right, John Adams ticked both sides off, was too independent minded. And so hence he did not win re-election. And perhaps it's arguably simplification of the issues, but I thought it was an interesting thesis that ought to be thought about. Okay. So then moving on, lastly, thank you for your time, you guys. I'm going to give you more than 5 points. Those of you who hang in there, okay? I'm going to give you more than 5 points for hanging in there for such a long PowerPoint and topic. It's a big bite to chew, right? Try to pretend to do the first 3 presidents in 1 week in one assignment. Um, Thomas Jefferson, right? Richard Hofstadter, I thought, did an interesting psychological thesis on this young man. In that, right, it focuses to me upon passive aggression, right? Whereby Thomas Jefferson, in his book, American Political Tradition, his chapter on Jefferson, you have a picture of Jefferson growing up with an aristocratic mom and his aristocratic maternal grandparents who snubbed their nose and were even emotionally and verbally abusive to their in law, his father, the commoner, Peter Jefferson, right? And had all these pretensions. And they were resentful to him also because of the rules um, of coverture in English political tradition, that the man inherits everything from the wife and her from her parents that are given to her. So at any rate, there was a lot of resentment going on. So they would put on their airs against their son-in-law, right? And the son supposedly had dad issues in which he never felt validated or affirmed by his dad. That his dad would pretty much tell him, hey, use that Randolph, that mother's blood and connections to your advantage, son. And you're not meant to work and be a farmer like me. Go and get educated. Don't get your hands dirty. Utilize those privileges. Become a political leader, right? Etc. But that Thomas Jefferson struggled in his identity with wealth guilt, he more than suggests. That he felt, as he was reading the Enlightenment, especially, right, that was anti-privilege, anti-aristocracy, and here he was living a privileged aristocratic lifestyle because of his mother and his mother's connections. But yet they were being abusive to his father, whom he idolized and never felt like truly gave him the affirmation that he needed. So hence, right, as a passive aggressive of catharsis, right, of getting venting all this emotion out, that he tried to portray himself as a democratic common man of the common person, right? To try to convince himself, his father, right, as well as the American public itself, that he was no spoiled aristocrat, that he was a man of the people, right, against any kind of pretensions and old school aristocracy, etc. So that you having a sense of wealth guilt going on, you're having a sense of compensation going on, and is that akin to demagoguery, right? Of a demagogue pretending to be someone that he's not. And so I find this fascinating. You find a similar thesis with Teddy Roosevelt later on. So at any rate, right, you have this component that I wanted you to look at on one number, this kind of passive aggressive decision to convey himself as a man of the people, right, from Thomas Jefferson, tied to psychology and to his upbringing with his dad and his mother's parents and mother. Okay, then so that's one number, the second to last. And then the final number is you have to resolve, look at, try to make sense of in some way, right? The apparent contradictions between what Jefferson practiced and what he preached. So, for instance, right, what he practiced, etc., or what he preached. Look at notes on the state of Virginia. He wrote letters to a French friend about what he thought of a myriad of topics about what life was like in Virginia and in America. And it ended up becoming published. So that is a big source of what we go to in looking at what Jefferson preached. Okay. And just to kind of give you a hint of just a general, synopsis of it, he was frightened to death that he was going to alienate and frighten and anger the right. So hence, right, he knew what he had written in that book and those letters were very far to the left. Anti-slavery, anti-aristocracy, pro-common man, pro-educational system, pro-land given to the poor, right, et cetera, right? Checks and balances, et cetera. And so then you have, of course, the Declaration of Independence and what he had written and what he had proposed as a governor of Revolutionary era Virginia and an assemblyman before that of Virginia. And then what he had written in the press under a pseudonym. that oftentimes happen, right? Is they would go in against each other in the press and they would use a fake old Roman or Greek name. And he and Madison just tore into how of Alexander Hamilton and even Thomas or even President Washington, who was his boss, right? As being the Secretary of the Treasury or Secretary of State. He tore into them. So that's what he claimed to stand for, right? But look what he actually does when he comes in. So, for instance, right, he buys the Louisiana Territory. Where in the Constitution does it state he can do that? That's a rhetorical question. It doesn't. But he did it anyway, right? Then, when he bought it, he sent the famous Meriwether Lewis and Clark, right? Lewis and Clark on an expedition that in some ways was definitely, scientific and intellectual. They, Meriwether Lewis, right, for instance, was to gather lots of data about the flora and fauna, about the animal and plant life, the geography of the West. He wanted to know this land that he was trying to purchase from France, right, from Napoleon. But arguably with Clark, you see in his addresses to the Native Americans, greetings from your great white father. I kid you not, he would tell them that on behalf of Jefferson. And from his notes and the deals that he would try to cut with the Native American tribes, you could make the argument that this was kind of a Old Testament Joshua expedition, kind of a spying expedition before an intention of conquering it, trying to get numbers on Native American tribes, see what in what ways they could be bought, what goods and commodities that they were willing to that they had a desire for, right? In ways in which sorry about that, they could come to terms with the federal government, and from whom they felt that they would likely incur opposition and what their military strength was. So he knew what who he could buy from Clark as far as tribes go, who he likely had to fight, and what was needed to defeat them in battle, etc. Right. So he's doing that with arguably at least partially imperialist aims, and then that entire region, right, that he buys, right. You can see it here smaller because you guys are over this map, but see the map here, right, and look at that brown stretch. That's a huge stretch of future states, right, and territories at that time period. So at any rate, in that entire area, he puts about 21 appointed men over that territory. No democratic government. And this is Mr. Democracy, right? But he contends, right, that the situation was too precarious. He had already had, you're going to have later on Aaron Burr, the same guy that shot Alexander Hamilton in the famous duel, right? Aaron Burr is going to supposedly have pretensions and conspiracies to take this territory in relation to Spain. Okay. He and a guy named Wilkinson over the military. And so you have evidence of conspiracies to sell the territory, to take the territory, right? And make deals with foreign countries that had once controlled it, namely Spain and France, right? You had demographics like the Cajuns, who had been deported from present-day Acadia, Canada, for their defiance, and now they have that defiant stigma or label on them, and here they are in Louisiana. The Creoles were pre-Enlightenment, old school, right? We read about them. Remember that French Louisiana was fluid, but not by choice, right? From these old school and pre-Enlightenment Creole leaders. And so a very proud demographic that wanted to represent themselves in their own institutions, customs, and their own power, right? So supposedly Thomas Jefferson looked at these demographics and said, you know what, they're not ready for democratic. They can't be trusted with democratic government under this territory yet, right? They haven't been properly educated, assimilated into American culture. I don't trust them as far as their pretensions and desires, et cetera, et cetera. So he contends, right, that the circumstances dictated that he could not practice his own rhetoric and allow democratic government in this territory. That again, practical necessity had him send Lewis and Clark on that expedition. That again, practical necessity had him purchase this land, which, as you see, is contiguous. The boundary touches old school America's Eastern Coast territory, right? So literally, he is touching territory with Napoleon. And remember, Napoleon was depicted as mercurial, as being bipolar, right? Of having of making these rash and and what's the word extemporaneous, without thinking, without planning, right? Decisions, amongst them to invade Russia, right? And other things that we're seeing, in Egypt, etc. And so he said, right, it is in our great interest and necessity not to have such a dangerous neighbor. It's in our best interest to buy this territory from him. Secondly, right, he contends that he wants to enhance the territory to give more land and more opportunities to the common Americans. Remember, he oftentimes justified his imperialism in that way, right? That yes, he had no problem taking land from Native Americans, from the Mexican government, from the Spanish or French government, right? But in the end, right, he wanted it for the common white American citizen to go and squat upon, perhaps like he tried in Virginia, to be granted free land, right, in that territory, because he was afraid that Alexander Hamilton was making the country in his own urban bourgeois image, right? His own Yankee New York image of having nothing but bankers and industrial factory owners, right? And and these other bourgeois people of the city take over the economy, right, and the government, right. And so to him, he wanted to secure and safeguard the liberty and the identity of this country. He wanted a lot of poor common white southerners and others, right, to inhabit as much of the domestic territory as possible. And if that meant enhancing the territory, he was all for it, right? And so, no, right, what I'm doing, kind of like with number two with John Adams, is this is Alan Brinkley, by the way. This is your textbook's thesis, right? And others as well, but sympathetic to Jefferson, saying, I don't think he contradicted himself because simply he became drunk with power, right? As sometimes people have become, or because he became innately more um, uh, conservative with age, right? They're not saying that. What they're saying, right? Or also another popular one, you guys, historically, was that he cut a deal with the opposition. Because when you look at his win in 1800, there was not a definitive electoral winner. So it went to the House. He went into the House, and his correspondence with the House reps is not written down. So we likely will never know what was said. But he was trying to convince them, right, to choose him and not Aaron Burr as the president. Some people contend that he made a deal and made a promise with the conservatives, right? That he would not be that liberal, he would not be that radical once he became president. Again, that's hard to prove or disprove. All right. But going back to this, right? What this favorable, sympathetic kind of court history thesis says, right, is this guy felt compelled by the circumstances, right? That it's easy to adhere to your beliefs when you're an intellectual like he was before, and you sit down and read and write stuff. But when you sit in that executive seat as the president and you run into very difficult, right, complex situations as the president of a country, you find that you can no longer be idealistic, but you have to become pragmatic. You have to do not what necessarily adheres to your ethics and your platform and your ideology, but you have to do what yields the best practical result in a given situation. And that includes, right, choosing the lesser evil in certain situations. So that's what he contends about this whole episode with the French Louisiana territory, that he violated his own preaching, his own rhetoric, right? Because practical necessity pushed him in that direction, and he felt he needed to as a lesser evil, as far as what the repercussions would have been had he left French Louisiana alone. Okay. And then, of course, you have the Tripolitan War or the Barbary Coast War. How ironic, right? He's against a standing army. He's against undeclared war, right? As a liberal. But when he becomes president, he sends some naval frigates to the coast of Tunisia and Morocco, right? To punish these Barbary Coast Muslim North African pirates that were given their blessing and patronage and payment, right, from the Bey, or like a governor, if you will, or basha, right, underneath a sultan of a Muslim sultanate, right? And so this Bey or basha was this gentleman, right? Was his name was oh gosh, shame on me. I got to go back to my notes. I'm embarrassed, you guys. I'd had this memorized for quite some time. Matter of fact, the book that I'm using, right, is interesting. The national bestseller, The Pirate Coast by Richard Zacks. All right. But this Basha, right? Sorry to turn my phone off. This Basha was endorsing piracy, okay, including of Americans, to come upon board, right, forcefully of these private merchant ships, make their demands as far as extortion, right? If the demands were not met, they would capture the people and take them and sell them, right? Either there in Tunis or even take them to a bigger slave market in Constantinople, Turkey, right? And have them sold as white slaves in the Muslim world. And so this was a nightmare, needless to say, right? For Europeans. It happened a lot with Italians, for instance, right? Especially down right there in the Mediterranean with them. And so Americans at times got caught up in this, right? So Thomas Jefferson contended, right, that it was imperative that we get out of our national debt. As a libertarian, right, he felt like Alexander Hamilton's bank needed to eventually be shut down, right? But for the time being, he felt begrudgingly that the bank had too many loans out to too many Americans. There was just too much at stake as far as the domino effect of shutting that national bank down, which he, of course, ideologically was opposed to, right? And so to him, as soon as we get out of our debt and settle certain economic preconditions, then we could finally, what he wanted ultimately, get rid of that bank, right? And diminish government, right? Because to him, that was the excuse Hamilton had for big government, for big brother, was debt, right? Economic necessity. So once we got that excuse, right, out of the way, Big Brother could step back. So he contended it was vital to getting out of debt, right, and for the integrity of the nation, for us to end this piracy. But notice, right, the military proud George Washington accepted this and accepted the fact that our guys had to pay tribute to these Barbary corsairs, as they were known. Okay. John Adams begrudgingly allowed it. But it's ironic, right, that Jefferson then says we can no longer tolerate this. So he sends the famous USS Philadelphia to punish them. And instead, it's sent in a trap, right? And it is entrapped in the reef and ends up the people therein. Now, remember, this is no longer just American citizens. And the Fifth Amendment says the government has the obligation to protect citizens' life, liberty, and property. Does that mean overseas? It's not clear. Different administrations have interpreted it differently. But now it's actually our servicemen in the Navy, right? Were taken for ransom to Tunis under this bay, right? So at any rate, right, the Basha held them, right, for a while. His name was Yusuf Karamanli, Yusuf Yussef, and then the last name Karamanli, right? And Yusuf had literally killed a brother to take this throne, and sent a more timid brother into to be a provincial leader in Libya, Egypt area to the east in North Africa. And so, and that brother was frightened of him greatly, right? Well, in addition to getting these men, remember, war had not been declared. And now here is, here Jefferson is sending these men over to this foreign country. Now they're captured. Now the press gets a hold of this. Now he's in trouble. He tries to secretly get Congress to endorse this, to contend that they had endorsed this instead of him. Then, in addition to having endorsed this, now he sends a rescue expedition, famously under Stephen Decatur and others, right, to come rescue them. And they don't quite do it, but they do damage to the port. They win a big naval battle, and supposedly help convince the Basha to demand and accept a ransom payment and get them and to send them back home, right? With the exception, by the way, of one traitor, according to the book. One of them converted to Islam and got to be an abusive guard over his very people. Needless to say, these sailors wanted this guy extradited back to the U.S. and punished. But at any rate, with that one exception, they eventually will come back home. But the press, right, through the press, the people are angry with President Jefferson with making this decision behind their back, right, this military decision. And then also, right, sending more men without a formal declaration of war. And then also he sends William Eaton, Eaton, and Eaton tries to raise an army of mercenaries that he raises with money given to him initially by the executive, and he was supposed to be endorsed by Congress as well. But again, a lot of this was secretively done by Jefferson himself, unbeknownst initially to Congress. William Eaton goes there, tries to raise an army in the Egypt-Libya area, and as you might guess, try to enlist the leadership of the timid brother, whose name was Ahmed, to try to initiate a coup against Yusuf, get this more ruthless brother off his Basha throne, and put in the more compliant brother Ahmed, who of course agreed, would not endorse the Corsairs in their acts of extortion in the Mediterranean. So at any rate, it fails, by the way, and Yusuf stays in command, but Yusuf grudgingly does sign an acknowledgement that he basically would try not to do it to American merchants there in the Mediterranean. So it kind of ends in a stalemate, if you will. But still, right, this was virtually an undeclared war. How ironic, right? That that was stated in the Declaration of Independence initially, right, in the list of grievances against George III that Jefferson himself had written, that he unilaterally sent boys to their death in foreign lands without Parliament's consent, in a declared war, et cetera, et cetera. So again, one more irony, right, for Thomas Jefferson. And then in addition to that, right, the irony of slavery with Sally Hemings, etc., right? At any given time, he had about 160 slaves. He put up a good front when people visited Monticello. He had, yes, Claire.
My class started at 11:30 and it ends at 12:30. Can I go? Because I only have 5 minutes left.
You can, Claire. Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
No problem. All right. So at any rate, right, this guy who wrote, right, against slavery, and he wrote against miscegenation, right? In particular, in the notes in the state of Virginia, he had written against a relationship between a master and a slave, right? Because he says, right, like autocratic tyrants in Europe, that a slave will necessarily a slave will be almost forced by the situation and the power dynamics themselves, will be forced to become a sycophant. And a sycophant, right, is someone who sucks up to a person in power, can never truly be honest with that person, right? Because there's too much to lose. There's too much at stake, right? So that person has to become a secret, like, insurrectionist, has to be a person who says everything his or her master wants to hear, but at the right time, whenever he or she can, right, will show his or her true colors and join a rebellion against him, or run away, etc., right? So to him, it was just an example, a microcosm of how unhealthy slavery is as an institution, having a white master with a black woman slave. And he does that very thing. And he keeps his slaves to the day of his death, right? And with Sally Hemings, he has a long term, lifetime affair with her, right? And agrees in getting her back from France because she could have stayed in Paris and kept her freedom. He supposedly makes a deal with her to come back to colonial, not colonial, but you know what I mean, slave induced Virginia, um, on the provision that he promised that at adulthood he would free their children, right? So you look at Madison and Beverly, they turned 18. It was agreed that they would be freed. The press got hold of his affair with Sally Hemings that he tried to keep secret, and he told them they had to wait longer. So angrily, Madison and Beverly especially ran away from him, and he arguably never saw them again because he told them they had to wait because his image was tarnished, and he was trying to keep this kept secret, right? And then initially, right, Eston, he eventually gave his freedom to Eston. Eston was seen as being kind of a darker mini-me version of him. He has a lot of primary source evidence of being very close to Eston, etc. But again, he let him go, and Eston went on a musical career after that. And he kind of kept himself distanced from Eston, arguably, partially, for to keep his own nose clean as far as his tarnished reputation for being with a black woman. He would not take that stance. So kind of like Hofstadter with that passive aggressive persona, is in a lot of biographies of Jefferson, he's seen as being very cowardly. So some of this could have been could have come down to that, his non-confrontational alleged cowardice. He would not take this issue on. So in certain books, right, that's the image that's conveyed, is that he felt that he was beyond his true secret sentiments really were against slavery, but that he felt he was way ahead of his generation. His for his own political survival, he could not be honest, that it was like raging against the waves of the ocean. It was inevitable that he would lose if he took that issue on. So he had to secretly just go with the flow and accept the inevitable, that his generation was not ready for that, right? And so hence he was too scared to take these issues on. So you have that contradiction as well, put in our textbook with Brinkley, etc., right? That he saw forces that seemed to be beyond his power, and he acquiesced. He grudgingly gave in to them and became a pragmatist, choosing the lesser evil of what he saw as available options that were available to him at that moment. Um, and that's how the author, Brinkley, and others, right, sometimes sympathetically address and interpret uh, multiple instances of Jefferson not practicing what he had preached, right? So that hence, not that he was a hypocrite, not that he changed with power, but that again, he contended that he was against forces too big for himself, and he had to pragmatically choose the lesser of evils in one instance after another. Any comments, you guys? I know that was huge. Okay. I'm going to look at the participants here that have lasted, and I'm going to give you double the points. Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I'm having a little question about like how you talk about like the liberal, conservative, right and left, democratic and republic. So
Uh-huh.
how do you kind of connect the dots with those things? Well,
Well,
which
with
kind of
today, right, there's no neat succession. There's no neat historical chronological line um, with the two parties today, right? A lot has changed. Um, so I wouldn't go that far. But as far as, you know, there being a left and right, there being virtually two parties, um, there being a dichotomy between um, those who were more uh, you know, kind of, you know, because I can't help but connect it to the later Civil War, right? That those who are more urban oriented, more in tune with connecting with the merchants, the manufacturers, the bankers and lenders, right? As opposed to those who are more for the cash crop farmers. I definitely see a tie of that going all the way through the Civil War of the 1860s, right? And the North versus the South. uh, a dichotomy between a party that was more libertarian, right, and were strict constructionist and wanting the government to only do what is explicitly given permission for it to do in the Constitution and not one thing more, versus those who say, well, there are inherent things, right, and implied things that the government also ought to be able to do, and they're more for a bigger, more robust government, right? You obviously see that dichotomy that is still alive and well today, right? And their differences in interpreting of the Constitution. I'm sorry, that's a weak answer, but that's my initial answer, Jaden, to your question. It's kind of superficial.
So basically, what I'm wondering is like you use the words liberal and conservative. Like, is liberal and conservative left or right?
That's the thing is ironically, right, the right today are libertarian, right? The right today are libertarian, and that was the left. Jefferson was libertarian in his rhetoric, Patrick Henry and those who claim to be the liberals then, right? um, and largely you can make the argument that the right has turned against Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, particularly Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, right? And his his you know, kind of welfare capitalist system that he implemented in the 1960s. Um, so there was kind of a reaction that, especially with those two administrations, there was a great kind of switch, right, of the conservatives to turn toward libertarianism. Uh, but yeah, I mean, like I said, the liberals were the libertarians back then. The conservatives were for bigger government and more government intervention in the economy. Then the Federalist right would kind of turn into the Whig Party against Andrew Jackson, and we'll get into that soon with the Jacksonian time period. And the Jackson period, they took Democratic Republican and morphed it just to Democrat, and they still ostensibly were for the common white Southern farmer, right? But yet they also were connected to the planter class. They would be connected to imperialism and taking of the West from Mexico, etc., right? And so definitely not connected to the rights of the minority groups yet, the Democratic Party, that is. Then the Whigs, right, will die off by 1854. And in that vacancy, in that opening or vacuum, will come arise the Republicans in the mid 1850s. And the Republicans, right, are to this day connected to the bourgeois class, right, for Hamilton's system of having government subsidize diversification, as many industries as possible, protect key industries with import tariffs, right? Help infrastructure develop by subsidizing it. The Republicans, that has lasted to this day. Um, but yet, ironically, right, the Republicans were connected initially for the Black people, taking a stance against slavery and its extension, taking a stand for the rights of African American men. And of course, by the time of the Great Society and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, that's going to switch. And the Democrats, right, under Lyndon B. Johnson, are going to embrace that mantle of helping African Americans out and being a party for the minorities, etc. All right.
So what party kind of was Washington and Alexander Hamilton?
So they were initially at their time period, they were Federalists. Their connection to a looser interpretation of the Constitution on behalf of a bigger government that had more involvement with the economy and that practically wanted an urbanized, industrialized giant to you know, erupt, and were therefore de facto more for the bourgeoisie. All of that would more in the future be connected to the Republican Party. Um, you know, but I think I'll choose to end my similarities there because, like I said, there's no neat historical continuity where that you could arguably say for certain that that Washington and Hamilton were modern day Republicans. Nothing happens that neatly in history.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Caitlin, did you have a question or comment?
Yes, I was just wondering. So last week we did the Constitution, and it was a different type of assignment. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at those or not, but I was just gonna check and make sure that I did it the correct way. But
Yeah,
as far
I'm
as
sorry,
this,
hon. I'm not there yet. I'm in the middle of the Southern colonies, sadly. But I have every intention, especially having this week off with my second school. I'm having every intention in the next few days to play catch up.
okay, thank you. And
Sorry about
then
that.
also, as far as this lesson goes, so were the Federalists, were they like Republicans?
Like I said, I would I only want to go as far as I feel safe, right? Without contradicting myself or giving you false information. As far as my ability to make that inference, I just want to keep it safe. And so for that reason, Caitlin, I just feel confident in just simply stating that the Federalists were like today's Republicans and that they wanted um, to for the government to get involved in ensuring that we become kind of industrialized, diversified, right? Become that kind of industrial giant that the Federalists wanted us to become. And so hence we're de facto kind of connected to economically to the bourgeoisie, to the bankers, to especially the entrepreneurs, the business owners, right, of multiple industries.
Yeah.
Um, the whole federalist idea, but you could make the same argument about the Democratic Republicans, but the Federalists also used a Alexander Hamilton as their poster child for the American dream, right? And claiming that everyone ought to rise by merit, by effort and work ethic and talent, right? And so, the Republican Party would do that with Abraham Lincoln, right, splitting rails and being a manual laborer from the Kentucky and Illinois and Indiana frontier area, right? So they had that continuation between the Federalist and the later Republican Party as well. But again, the Federalists at their time period, it was the Democratic Republicans who were libertarian, who were afraid of Big Brother, right? And wanted a strict interpretation of the Constitution and keep government intervention minimal. And now, right, it was actually ironically the Democratic Republicans share that today, arguably with the Republicans, not the Democrats, right? Who have largely become more libertarian in their platform.
Okay, that makes sense. And then another question is
Sure.
that so those wars that John Adams declared or tried to declare without the Congress, did he did society lash back at him for doing that, or did they not really realize that that was wrong?
That's a great question. With John Adams, right, in his quasi almost war in the Caribbean, it was largely split between left and right. The right liked it because remember, the right, the Federalists, wanted to get in these Napoleonic Wars against this crazy revolutionary radical French government, right? And so something was better than nothing. While there had not yet been a war declared, the fact that we were fighting for our rights on the high seas, right? Not to have our stuff, our non contraband stuff, confiscated by the French Navy. The right was delighted about this as far as our international rights, our national honor, their kind of bellicosity, their almost desire for war with Napoleonic France. All of that, right, made it somewhat popular amongst the Federalists and those on the right during John Adams' time period. But of course, those on the left who did not want to go to war with revolutionary France, did not want to get sucked into this, who on principle felt, if anything, because both sides are violating our international rights on the high seas, we ought to fight England and the conservative powers instead, right? Because we owe our treaty of alliance from the past still to France, because France is continuing the revolution that they say we began, right? In line with the Enlightenment, etc. They, for those reasons, and then also, right, those on the left did not want government doing anything that the Constitution did not explicitly tell them they could do. So for at least those three reasons, those on the left hated the quasi-war and thought, right, that John Adams was being a tyrant and a troublemaker and getting us involved. Then with the next president, with Thomas Jefferson and his Barbary Coast War, you didn't see that simple left and right line as clearly as you did in the quasi-war of the Caribbean with John Adams, the second president. With Adams, or with Jefferson, the third president, there was more. You still saw that to a degree, right? Of people on the left trying to defend his actions, but it was largely more seen as just an unpopular, undesirable war. In light of the fact that the French Revolution, it hit home. We had a contract with them. We had an alliance with them, right? A lot of demographically, Americans had immigrated and come from Western Europe, France and England, etc., right? So we had more of a familiarity and more context of a connection with an a vested interest in what was going on in these Napoleonic wars. With North Africa, it being, the Moors of North Africa were Berber and Carthaginian and Arabic and African in origin. They were Muslim in heritage, right? And so this was seen as more of like a foreign entanglement that a lot of Americans thought, what in the world should we have to do with that on the other side of the war with such an exotically different people, right? And so that's my 2 cents on it. I hope I somewhat answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so anyone else? All right, I will probably have to split this in half as we've gone over 2 hours. Yes, Jaden.
Are you gonna post this the slideshow on the
Yeah, I'll be happy to. Sure. I'll make a note. I'll be happy to put all the PowerPoints that we've looked at today online. Okay, so like I said, I'll probably have to split this in half. Those of you who have lasted, I'm going to give you 10 extra points instead of 5. Okay, that's the least that you have earned and endured from me today. And again, I'm very likely going to have to split this in half, it being over 2 hours long. Okay, so thank you. Keep that in mind when you're looking at this assignment. I believe I asked you to choose 2 this week, right? So keep that in mind as well. They don't have to be that long. Okay. And if you have any questions or anything, just Canvas message me, okay? And I will continue on. I will continue in my grading process, okay, Caitlin, and try to get to that Constitution assignment as soon as possible.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. That's the least I can do. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for hanging with me today, okay, guys?
Thank you.
You're very welcome, Jaden. You guys have a good day, okay? Good luck with your assignment. I know you'll do well.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.